Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Once again, good morning. It's Thursday, April 13th, the 8th day of Pesach if you observe 8 days, or the day after Pesach ends if you're a Reform Jew. Or any Jew living in the land of Israel observes 7 days of Pesach, which is what the Torah commands, 7-day holiday. We are returning to our study of Talmudic passages that contemplate the meaning, causes, and possible responses to human suffering. Specifically, we're going to start on Daf 5a, page 5a of Tractate Berakhot, which is the first tractate in the Talmud. We've looked at Berakhot. We looked actually just a couple pages down the road, 7b, 7a, a few weeks ago. So there's a lot in Berakhot that contemplates the question of human suffering. And we will continue to look at Berakhot this week and into next week. Then we are off again on April 27th because I have a full day of commitments in the city and can't teach on April 27th. But we will, never fear, return to our study on May I think we're off for 2 weeks and then we're back May 11th. Don't quote me on it. 18th and 25th. So we'll keep going up until just before Memorial Day. But this daf will occupy our attention for quite some time to come. There's a lot in here. We won't get through all of it today. So we'll pick up next week. So I'd like to begin by sharing the screen and inviting us to pick up in the middle of Berakhot 5a. Amar Rabbah. Now, there's this lengthy introduction here that I don't think is particularly helpful for us, so I'm going to skip over it and just pick up at the bold print, which is Rava, and some say Rav Chisda said, if a person sees that suffering has befallen him, he should examine his actions. In the Hebrew, it says Amar Rava, Rava said, the Itema Rav Chisda, and some say it was Rav Chisda who said this, so there's a question of attribution. Im roe adam she Yisurin ba'in alav. This is the key word for today. This is the word where we're going to spend most of our time. This Hebrew word that I've highlighted, Yisurin ba'in alav, yifash peish b'ma'asav. Okay, so if a person sees, im roe adam, if a person sees, she Yisurin, this word, ba'in alav, that if Yisurin means chastisements, punishments, suffering, some kind of negative experience, something that's really unpleasant. And the Talmud will, of course, want to unpack, well, what qualifies as Yisurin. But the word is best translated as chastisements or punishments. Ba'in alav mean have come upon him. Yifash peish b'ma'asav. What should he do? He should examine closely b'ma'asav. Ma'asav are his deeds. And then there's going to be a proof text, shenemar. So just taking the text at face value, what is assumed? If a person sees that suffering has befallen him, he should examine his actions. What is assumed in that diagnosis? Or I should say prescription. The diagnosis is, help doctor, I'm suffering. The prescription is, go examine your actions. So what are possible underlying assumptions? Mom and Dad, why don't you unmute and offer the first comment here?
What did you do to deserve this?
What did you do to deserve this? Exactly. Audrey, anything to add? You put your hand down, which suggests to me that that summarized what you wanted to say as well, right? So the logic of the statement, if you are suffering, you should examine your deeds, would imply something you did may have prompted your suffering. Okay. Already we're in challenging theological territory, but let's not forget what we've discussed before, which is that there is a significant biblical overlay or underlay, perhaps, a stratum beneath all this. The whole book of Deuteronomy is premised on the idea that God rewards you for your righteous behavior, for your willingness to adhere to the covenant. God will punish you for your waywardness, right? If you stray from the covenant, God will bring about curses. If you stick to the covenant, you follow the mitzvot of Adonai, God will reward you. This also comprises the last several chapters of the book of Leviticus, the same kind of doctrine of rewards and punishments. Brief sidebar, scholars of the Torah who are versed in a historical, critical approach to our sacred text have noted that both the end of the book of Leviticus and the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which, as I've just said, underscore this way of thinking, that if you adhere to God's covenant, you'll be blessed. If you stray from God's covenant, you'll be cursed, resemble the way in which ancient treaties were written when a conquering suzerain or warlord or tribal chieftain would subjugate a conquered people or nation. A treaty would be drawn up that says, hey, meet the new boss, as the Who would say, same as the old boss, right? Meet the new boss. Here are the terms of your status as a vassal nation to the great lord such and so. If you adhere to said terms, you will be rewarded in all these following ways. If you stray, if you disobey, you will be punished in all of these ways. So the covenantal framework for our holy books in the Torah seems to have analogs, or maybe even to have been modeled on Near Eastern treaties between a conquering chieftain and a subjugated people. That's an interesting way of thinking about what this says about the Israelite relationship with its deity, with God. Nevertheless, it provides a theological norm that has a long shelf life in Judaism, even as it prompts strong reaction, both pro and con, for and against. As I have said in previous sessions, the entire book of Job appears to me to be a polemic against the theology of reward and punishment being commensurate for righteousness or waywardness. The book of Job says, here's a man who is suffering, and he did not deserve it. That flies in the face of what the end of the book of Deuteronomy, or for that matter, as I've just said, the end of the book of Leviticus would propose about the way in which God works, the way in which suffering operates. Now, what is being proposed here in the Talmud is kind of a logical inversion of the equation. This says, start from the premise that one is suffering, and now you have to trace back what is the cause. Implied in the prescription, examine your deeds, is the assumption that the cause may be something you did to deserve this. And again, the this, deserve what, in this statement is the Hebrew word Yisurin, which means chastisements or punishments or suffering. The proof text comes next, as is customary in the Talmud. You want to substantiate a claim that is made, you find another scriptural verse to back it up. As it is said, we will search and examine our ways and return to God, from the book of Lamentations. Clicking here, you can actually see the verse. So the book of Lamentations, which is traditionally attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, though there's no critical evidence for that, it is simply the traditional attribution, is the great poetic response to the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians in the early part of the 6th century BCE. And we're looking at, starting at verse 38, or let's go to 37. Whose decree was ever fulfilled unless the Lord willed it? Is it not at the word of the Most High that weal and woe befall? Here, better in Hebrew, mipi elyon Lo tetzei hara'ot va'atov, are not both evil and good from the mouth of the Most High, or emerge from the mouth of the Most High. Of what shall a living man complain? Each one of his own sins, right? So you have only to complain about what you have wrought, what you have brought upon yourselves. Let us search and examine our ways and turn back to the Lord. All right, so this fits the theology of the Talmudic passage that we're studying. It's a really good proof text in that it proposes that if you are suffering, it's something you did, look to your own deeds, and then return unto God. Audrey, why don't you lower your, or raise your, unmute yourself, and then you can comment here.
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds to me like Jewish guilt.
Yes, I
And
mean,
also, I mean, I just lost a friend, and what are you going to say? She was guilty?
right, I'm so sorry, by the way. Right, I mean, so the question is, again, we haven't really examined what qualifies as Yisurin, what is suffering, what counts as suffering. Is death itself a punishment? Is death itself suffering? Is the death of a loved one suffering? We haven't answered that question yet, but the Talmud will endeavor to do just that. Okay.
But Jewish guilt, I mean,
Right. Maybe it's something you did.
yeah,
Maybe it's something
always.
right. Maybe it's something you did to deserve this. Yep, Jewish guilt is not new in the age of your parents or grandparents. It's been with us from the very first. Okay, so the proof text is, we will search and examine our ways and return to God. And again, if you look at the context of that verse, as we just did, you will see that the context is that the suffering of the Jewish people as a collective can be attributed to the sin of the individual. If one examined his ways and found no transgression for which that suffering is appropriate, and notice how much of this is an interpolation. The Talmud just says, if he examined, found no, right? Or here, picking up here, pishpesh velo matzah. Literally, he searched but did not find. So if one searched his deeds and found nothing warranting the suffering, yitzleh bevitul Torah. All right, let's look at what that translates to. He may attribute his suffering to dereliction in the study of Torah. In other words, if you've examined what you've done to warrant your suffering, you come up finding nothing, it must be that you didn't study enough Torah. Again, I'm not here to espouse the views that we are learning. I'm here strictly as your friendly guide through Talmud. I said that because I anticipate that, like me, many of you resist the theological claims that are being made here, that if a person is suffering and cannot find any other cause that would merit the suffering, it must be that that person didn't study enough Torah, right? That is a theologically obnoxious claim,
Right.
to me, and probably to many of you. As it says in the gloss here, God punishes an individual for dereliction in the study of Torah in order to emphasize the gravity of the issue. And now the proof text will try and underscore that. Shene'emar always introduces a proof text, as it is said, Ashrei hagever asher tiyasrenu ya umitoratcha tilamdenu. All right, how do they translate this verse, which is from Psalms chapter 94, verse 12? Happy is the one whom you punish, O God, and teach out of your law. What the rabbis are doing here is they are perhaps providing a hyper-literal reading that connects the first clause of the verse to the second clause of the verse. All right, so one is happy to be punished by God and teach out of your law, and where the Hebrew word for law is, of course, mitoratcha, from your Torah, tilamdenu, you teach him. So the link that is provided in this verse is the suffering of a person and the learning of Torah. This verse teaches us that his suffering will cause him to return to Torah. Aaron, a faithful student of Torah, please comment.
She does.
You have to unmute, Aaron.
It sounds almost like they're acknowledging that there's no reason, and it's a very human thing to try to find control where there's no control.
Yeah.
So they're just making up a reason that God would be punishing you when they acknowledge there isn't one.
I completely agree with your conclusion. I completely agree. It seems to me, I think it is a logical and entirely reasonable inference that the rabbis may be grasping at straws here, and the best they can come up with for inexplicable suffering is, well, must have been a dereliction in the study of Torah. It's an easy one because the rabbis elsewhere claim that this is one of those deeds without measure. You can never do it enough.
Well, and it's always more comforting to people, at least in my experience, to have control, because then it feels like you can prevent these things from happening again in the future, as opposed to just random bad luck.
Right. Nobody wants to, or at least these rabbis are not willing to cop to random bad luck. They need an explanation for why bad things may be happening to an otherwise perfectly good person. I completely agree. Thank you for sharing. Barbara, why don't you comment here? Barbara, are you with us? We can't hear you for whatever reason. I see your mouth moving, and I see that you're muted now. Try unmuting. Nope, you're not connected to the audio for whatever reason. I'm so sorry. So see if you can figure that out on your end. It's not something I can fix, unfortunately. And if you're able to, we'll hear from you when you're able to connect to the audio. Okay. So let's carry forward in our study, because I think we've said what needs to be said about that little miniature sugya, but the sugya, the larger subject, continues in the following passage. The im tala velo matzah. Okay, so at least Aaron and others might find some comfort in what gets acknowledged here. If he did attribute his suffering to the dereliction in the study of Torah and did not find this to be so, in other words, he said, all right, I know the traditional wisdom because I'm a student of Talmud, that I've done nothing to deserve why I'm suffering. And it can't be because I've been derelict in the study of Torah, because I'm not derelict in the study of Torah. Then he may be confident that these are, in fact, afflictions of love. Okay, this is where things get really interesting. The im tala velo matzah. So if he did attribute his suffering to dereliction in study of Torah, but realized that that is not a satisfactory answer, right? He isn't derelict in the study of Torah. Biadua, he can be sure, he knows, Yisurin shel Ahava, that whatever he's suffering comes from a place of love. Mommy, why are you doing this to me? I'm doing it because I love you. Daddy, why did you give me a timeout? Because I love you, right? We do say that, though perhaps for a child, particularly a child of certain youth and developmental growth yet to come, may need further explanation. What's the connection between something I don't like experiencing and parental love? Well, any number of reasons why we might expose a child to something that he or she does not enjoy out of love. And that is what is being claimed here of God. That God, in this quasi-parental role, is afflicting a person not because the person is being punished, but rather as a demonstration of God's love. Now, this is an idea that has a lot of legs in Jewish tradition. In other words, it's an idea that is carried forward and in many different directions throughout Jewish thought, throughout rabbinic thought in particular. It is known by the name that was just given to it in the Talmud, Yisurin shel Ahava, literally chastisements of love. And that is the main subject that will occupy us for the rest of today and into next week's class as well, and maybe even beyond. This idea that we suffer not out of punishment for a transgression, but rather as a sign of God's love or even God's favor. Try and suspend your discomfort, or even better, lean into your discomfort, because I think that the discomfort will be a goad to deeper insight into how this text plays out. And I'm going to put on the screen a different passage that I'd like for us to look at. from, let's see if I can get the title. I'm just sort of like manipulating the size of the text so that it's readable, but you can also see the title. Okay, so the corresponding text we're looking at right now, as you can see up in the title here, is Bereshit Rabbah 55. Bereshit Rabbah is the great compendium anthology of Agadic Midrash, in this case on the book of Genesis. So Midrash is a genre of rabbinic literature that is concurrent with the development of Talmudic literature. So we're talking about literature that was developed in the Tanaitic, Amoraitic periods and continues even to the present day. Midrash is any rabbinic literature that seeks to expound or expand the meaning of our scriptural tradition, of the verses of Torah and Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. In this case, I need not introduce you in great detail to the subject matter because I'm going to assume that for almost everyone in this class, it is familiar. We are looking at Midrash, at Agadic Midrash, that is folkloric Midrash, as opposed to the Talmud, which is generally classified as being a chiefly halachic work, a work that is chiefly about Jewish law, though as you've seen, we have focused very little on halakha. We've actually been looking much more into theology and folktales and whatnot. Nevertheless, the base orientation of the Talmud, as we saw last week in our pre-Pesach lecture 2 weeks ago, is halachic. The base orientation of Midrash is Agadic or folkloric, though even then, occasionally, a legal precept is elucidated, and therefore it's kind of peppered throughout with halachic rulings or halachic statements. The chief approach of Midrash is to take scriptural text and elucidate them. So this is a Midrash based on the story of the binding of Isaac. Genesis chapter 22, the Akedah or Akedat Yitzchak, the story that is read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, or in many Reform communities, including our own, on the first morning of Rosh Hashanah, the morning of the first day. And that story begins with the following words, Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ela. And so after these things, Vayisa, I'm now, Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'ela, Vayisa et Avraham. God tested Abraham. All right, so the idea that Abraham, who has done nothing wrong, is about to endure a divine test is the subject of the Midrash we're going to look at right now. And the rabbis are curious about this because, again, Abraham is not just an ordinary person. He is a supremely righteous person in the way the rabbis read the Torah. So the idea that Abraham, of all people, would be asked to do the unthinkable and offer his only son, his beloved son, Isaac. Yes, there's also Ishmael. But for the purposes of Midrash, Isaac is of course, the one that Abraham, to whom Abraham is bound in love forever. That Abraham would be asked by God to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering is absolutely unthinkable. And so the rabbis take note of the fact that the text itself in the Bible declares that this is a test. Right? We know from the very first verse of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac story, that God is testing Abraham. And so the question is asked. Adonai, forgive the dash instead of the letter O. I think that is a little bit of a superstition that I don't observe, but that's how they translate it here. Adonai tries the righteous. Try, better word would be test. And God's soul hates the evil ones and those who love violence. Okay, so that is a verse from Psalm 11. This is typically the way Midrash works. Midrash often begins with a verse from what I call the outfield of the Hebrew Bible. In this case, Psalms. And it's going to bring it home to home plate, where home plate is the verse from the book of Genesis that we are contemplating. And so God tested Abraham. So you have this verse up top, Adonai tzaddik yivchan. God tests the tzaddik. God tests the righteous. The rasha ohev chamas. Whereas the wicked person loves violence. Sana nafsho, God's soul despises that person. So it's a bit of a twisty poetic verse. All right, let's look at it in the English. Rabbi Yonatan, a rabbi with a great name, Rabbi Yonatan said, when a flax worker knows that his flax is of good quality, the more he beats it, the more it improves and the more it glistens. But if it is of inferior quality, he cannot give it one knock without it splitting. Similarly, Adonai does not test the wicked. Why? Because they cannot withstand it, as it is written, and the evil ones God expels like the sea. So whom does God test? The righteous. As it says, Adonai tests the righteous. All right. So there are going to be three explanations for why the wicked prosper, but more importantly, why the righteous suffer. Why would the righteous suffer? Let us assume that suffering may be a test from God, right? That adage, which is surely familiar to all of us, though I personally do not subscribe to it. I find it theologically obnoxious, which is God only gives us as much as we can stand, or something like that. I think that's a very harmful and insensitive comment to make to anyone who's going through some stuff. God doesn't give you more than you can stand. It's like, well, what does that mean? I find it yucky. Nevertheless, let us not judge, let us simply enter the world of rabbinic discourse. God tests the righteous. In the case of the analogy to the flax worker, what's the point? Why would God cause a righteous person, to endure suffering according to the analogy of the flax worker? I'll put it back on the screen just so you can be refreshed between all of my blabbing. All right, Aaron, take it.
So that it could become the best version of itself, or himself or herself.
Right. Because beating the flax improves it. Similarly, causing somebody who's already made of, strong moral stock to endure suffering actually improves that person. Judy Gross.
And in terms of studying Torah, you can never study enough. So if they're still righteously adhering to scriptures and get punished, well, you've got to do even better. You've got to.
Right. You can always improve. And by the way, room for improvement is premised on a person being good to begin with. Right. So the other part of the analogy to the flax worker is that if you have shoddy material to begin with, you don't try and improve it by beating it, because it's just going to break. So you start with the good stuff, but by beating it, it becomes soft and fine and better. Arlene Goldsmith, please.
Okay, first of all, I apologize for my screen. It has a number of cracks on it. It's going to be
We can't see those, by the way. You look fine to us.
Okay. So in all of this, we seem to be only talking about what happens with adults. Does the Talmud at any point interpret anything when bad things happen to kids?
It does, but I'm just not sure where. But I can find that out. I can find that out. Yep. Yeah, the audience here is
that's very critical.
Right.
They are totally innocent in their actions, and yet horrific things happen. And how can they even be held accountable?
Right. Right. Yeah. This really, as we've learned, this gets to the heart of Erin's professional life, where she works with very sick children. So, right, what could possibly account? The whole idea that you can even examine your deeds assumes that you have deeds that can be examined, whereas a young person does not have deeds that can be examined. And the Jewish tradition would corroborate that elsewhere, that a person's deeds don't really count until you reach the age of bar bat mitzvah. So anyone younger than that is, a work in progress. Obviously, there are certain moral expectations of an 8-year-old that are not imposed on a 2-year-old. Nevertheless, before the age of adulthood, bar bat mitzvah, the rabbinic tradition is that a person is not morally accountable for his or her deeds. Aaron.
I would add that I think the parents feel like it's a punishment for them and that their children are the that manifests.
I can only imagine some of the conversations you've had that lead you to that conclusion. Right. What did we do to deserve this? Mom and Dad.
This begs the question of what makes a person so wicked that they are not worthy of God's attention.
Correct. Okay, so fortunately, it's not the last voice to comment in this particular midrash. So let's read forward because, all right, so premise number one is God would cause the righteous to endure suffering in order to bring about an improvement in their character, starting with something good to begin with, could be even better. I'll test them and they'll get better through their suffering. All right, that's the flax worker analogy. That is not the only allegory that is brought in this three-part midrash. So the second one. All right. And there's another proof text here. Who does God test? The righteous, as it says, Adonai tests the righteous. And it was after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Yosef and said, lie with me. So this is a reference to Mrs. Potiphar. Mrs. Potiphar is the wife of the Egyptian army captain in whose house Joseph becomes like the chief steward. And Mrs. Potiphar takes a shine to young Joseph and tries to seduce him, but he resists her wiles and ends up going to prison on a trumped up charge of rape that Mrs. Potiphar engineers. And that's the part of Genesis 39 that we're looking at. So Joseph clearly is the righteous who is being tested in this case. And he will suffer for it, right? He will go to prison and suffer inordinately for 2 years because he's an innocent man. All right, next explanation. And it was after these things, looking back to the Torah, Rabbi Yonatan said, so this is the same rabbi, by the way. This is a classic three-point sermon. Rabbi Yonatan is up there on the pulpit in the ancient academy, and he is giving a morning sermon on the binding of Isaac, conjecturing around the question, why would God test somebody who is righteous? Proposal number one, in order to help that person improve through suffering. Second one, Rabbi Yonatan said, a potter does not test defective vessels because he cannot give them a single blow without breaking them, right? So if you are working in clay and you've made a number of clay vessels, clay jugs, and you shape the clay into a pot and you put it in the kiln and you fire the vessels, and then you pull out your tray, and there are 10 vessels on the tray, and 3 of them have cracks that surfaced when the fire was put to the clay. Well, the potter is going to take his rod to check the vessels, but he doesn't need to check the ones with the big cracks in it because he knows that if he strikes them even lightly, it will shatter. What then does he test? Only the strong vessels, the one that appear without defect, for he will not break them even with many blows. Similarly, the Holy One of Blessing does not test the wicked, but rather the righteous, as it says, Adonai tests the righteous. Now, this is a different explanation than the flax worker. In this analogy, the potter, what's the point of enduring suffering? Audrey. Unmute. Yeah.
My comment was actually in follow-up of what your father had said. How evil could somebody be? But then you wonder, why did they have Yom Kippur back then? I mean, the whole idea of teshuvah and turning around and being that God invites you to do that as opposed to just labeling you as a lost cause.
I would agree, and probably not for nothing, this sermon would have been given on Rosh Hashanah as a lead-in to the 10 Days of Atonement, right? So it is conceivable that the rabbis are more aware of this than we may be giving them credit for being, that this is a perfect lead-in to talk about the way in which teshuvah is the process by which we, frail, flawed mortals, improve ourselves, that we need not simply give up because we cannot be perfect. Aaron, comment here on the potter, perhaps?
Yes, this one seems like he's just trying to figure out if they'll break.
Right.
Which
I
is
need to put
harder
these
for-
people through suffering in order to figure out which ones are truly righteous. It's a test in order to weed out, right? This will separate, forgive the gender specificity here, this separates the men from the boys. Okay. Again, I'm not asking you to like these comments. I'm merely asking you to enter into the world of rabbinic discourse. Now, there's one more analogy which is given in this mini sermon. This one by Rabbi Yonatan's counterpart, Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar said, when a man possesses two cows, one is strong and the other weak, on which one does he put the yoke? Surely on the strong one. Similarly, God tests only the righteous, as it says, Adonai tests the righteous. Now, this is a third analogy, and this is also different. So the first one is in order to improve the person. The second one is in order to detect who is truly righteous and who is not. The third, the analogy of the two oxen or the two cows, one bears the burden, one doesn't. What's the point? Aaron, go for it.
that he's the one that can handle it.
Right. Which begs all sorts of other theological sub-questions. It's like, well, must there be suffering in the world? Like, why does anyone have to suffer in the first place? And also one might ask, well, the analogy to a yoke around one's neck would suggest that there's some productive benefit that is going to come of all of this suffering, right? You yoke an animal in order to plow a field. So we know what the yoke the animal might be, it is suffering. What is the plow the field in this analogy? What is being accomplished for the greater benefit of the world by a righteous person enduring suffering? That question goes unanswered here. So now back to our Talmudic text, but I wanted you to see that there are so many places in the Talmud that talk about the idea of the righteous suffering. And in the case of the Talmudic passage we're looking at, such suffering by the righteous for reasons that are not related to punishment. In other words, the righteous is not a person who deserves punishment, hence he's righteous. If a person is righteous, it stands to reason the person is not deserving of retribution or chastisement. Therefore, the Talmud says a righteous person who suffers is enduring what they call Yisurin shel Ahava, afflictions or chastisements of love, as it is stated in the book of Proverbs, for the one whom the Lord loves, God rebukes, as does a father the son in whom he delights. Excuse the Yoda-like syntax here, right? So the full verse in Proverbs starts in verse 11. Musar Adonai b'ni al tim'as. Again, inverted syntax here, but my son, do not spurn the discipline of Adonai, ve'al takotz b'tochachto. Do not abhor God's rebuke. Ki et asher ye'echav Adonai yochiach. For God will rebuke the one God loves, ye'echav from Ahava. Uche'av et ben yirtzeh. Just as the son whom God favors. Just as a son whom a father favors. I'm doing this because I love you, right? Dad, why are you always picking on me and my little brother, gets away with murder? Because your little brother's a shmendrik, right? Like, because you're the one, I count on you to be the good kid. So of course I ride you harder. Coach, why are you always correcting me on the mound? Because you're my star pitcher, right? I don't need to rebuke the second baseman who's an idiot. He can't improve. I don't expect him to be great. All right, now you follow how this works? Yisurin shel Ahava. Dear God, why am I suffering? Because I love you, because I'm counting on you, because you're the one I can rebuke, because you're the one who needs it. Michelle.
What tools of rebuke or chastisement does God have other than what we perceive as suffering?
That is where this will go. All right, so let's we're going to talk about that. Let's do it in the Talmud. So it really begs the question, well, what are we talking about? What counts as Yisurin and what does not count as Yisurin, these so-called chastisements? Judy, do you want to comment here?
Yeah, quick comment. This leads to us as the Jews as being the chosen people.
Say more. I think you're right.
Yeah. We are chosen to suffer because we can lead the way. We are worth it. We are God's, which is, of course, scary to think about and what has been such a nemesis for us throughout history. But we're so good. We'll be able to bear it. We'll take it.
Yeah, you would not be a first to draw a link between chosenness and the yoke or the burden. And maybe that could be the plowing the field, right? It's like, well, the Jewish people have suffered inordinately in a way that is correlated to or commensurate with our role to be a light unto the nations. Okay, moving on. Yisurin shel Ahava. What are these Yisurin? Okay, so Rabbah said, so Amar Rabbah, we're in the next little pericope, the next little passage, Amar Rav Sechora. So he's quoting his rabbi Rav Sechora, Amar Rav Huna rather. So quoting Rav Huna. Kol shehakadosh baruch hu chafatz bo, anyone in whom God delights, midak'o b'yisurin. He pushes him, he shoves him with suffering, with yisurin, chastisements. Shene'amar vadonai chafetz dak'o hecheli. All right, now this is important because a specific kind of suffering is noted in the verse from Isaiah 53:10. But the Lord chose to crush him by disease, hecheli, from choleh, which means to be sick. Vadonai chafetz dak'o hecheli. But the Lord chose to crush him by disease, that if he made himself an offering for guilt, he might see offspring and have long life, and that through him the Lord's purpose might prosper. Now, this is from a long section. You see that we're in Isaiah chapter 53. This is from what scholars refer to as Deutero-Isaiah, the second Isaiah. In terms of the reading of Isaiah, which is a 66-chapter book of prophecy, starting at chapter 40, we enter what's known as Deutero-Isaiah. Most scholars of biblical literature would aver that this is probably a different author than whoever is responsible for chapters 1 through 40, and that Isaiah is itself a composite work, and that even Deutero-Isaiah may be composite of several different authors. But we have moved into the second part of the prophecies of the book of Isaiah, which promise that though we suffer collectively as a nation, yet God will redeem us and we have cause for hope. That's the basic theme of second Isaiah. The prophecies of Deutero-Isaiah are read specifically in the 7 weeks leading from after Tisha B'Av, the observance of the destruction of the temples, on the 9th of Av, in the depths of summer, for 7 weeks leading up to Rosh Hashanah. There are 7 haftarot, 7 prophetic readings on Shabbat for the 7 weeks from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah that provide words of comfort. They all come from this part of Isaiah. They all come from the latter chapters of the book of Isaiah, or Deutero-Isaiah. Some even say that the very final chapters of Isaiah belong to a school or an author who is known in scholarly circles as Trito-Isaiah, the third Isaiah. Be that as it may, though we suffer, yet God will redeem us and give us hope. That's the theme. And there is a whole section in Isaiah chapter 53 known in scholarly circles as the prophecy of the suffering servant. We all went astray like sheep. This is picking up at verse 6, each going his own way, and the Lord visited upon him the guilt of all of us. By the way, a lot of this text is set in the libretto of Handel's Messiah. All we like sheep, all we like sheep have gone astray, all the melismatic Handel vocal writing. He was maltreated, yet he was submissive. He did not open his mouth, like sheep being led to the slaughter, like a ewe dumb before those who shear her. He did not open his mouth. Handel used the King James translation of the Bible, so some of this won't be familiar in the ear if you know Messiah, the oratorio. Nevertheless, the whole bit about he was despised, he was rejected, he did not turn his head to those who would spit on him, all of that stuff, the suffering servant. In Christian faith, in the Christian community, the suffering servant prophecy of Isaiah is used to predict or forecast the suffering of Jesus. In the Jewish community, and I would say the original intent of the literature of Second Isaiah is to personify the community of the people of Israel as a human being, as a man who suffers inordinately at the hands of God. So not a forecast of Jesus and his passion, passion being a word from the Latin passus, meaning to suffer. The very graphic and elongated section of the story of Jesus told in the Gospels of his suffering leading up to his crucifixion, death, and ultimate resurrection. The passion of the Christ is a word that means the suffering of Jesus, who is the Messiah. Isaiah is used as a Christian proof text for that suffering that precedes his official death and resurrection. In the Jewish community, this is all a personification or a big metaphor for the suffering of the Jewish people, which is a prelude to our ultimate redemption and cause for hope. Okay, so back to the Talmud now. If we're looking just at the passage under examination for today, oopsie daisy, give me a second. So closing out the sidebar for Isaiah, yet in whom the Lord delights, God oppresses him with disease. So one way in which you know that you might have Yisurin shel Ahava, God punishing you out of love, is if you are ill. And it gives you the rest of the verse here, to see if his soul would offer itself in guilt, that he might see his children lengthen his days, and that the desire of the Lord might prosper by his hand. In other words, there might be a redemptive outcome for this person. This verse illustrates that in whomever God delights, he afflicts with illness. I hate this theologically, by the way. I just want you to understand. Okay, right. The book of Job is, again, a flat-out rejection of this way of thinking. So getting back to something Aaron said before, it is, I think, entirely reasonable and warranted to speculate that comments like this arise out of a totally natural, universal, human desire, even need, human need for things to have reasons, for suffering to have meaning. It can't just be that good people get metastatic lung cancer. That was my first meeting this morning. Congregants in their young 30s, and her dad has been diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic lung cancer, age 67. Fortunately, they did not ask, why is this happening? They're very theologically sophisticated people. They understand that sometimes bad, even terrible things happen, and there doesn't need to be a reason. What the Talmud does want to present here, by the way, is at least comforting to the extent that it is not saying, well, your dad must have been a bad guy, or he must have done something bad. It is saying, no, your dad could be a perfectly wonderful guy, and God loves him, and that's why he has this illness, out of love. Okay. It's not great. You can also see the way in which the rabbis are twisting themselves into knots, not to deny the existence or the power of God. Right? They can't get to a place in this passage where they say, well, God is just asleep at the wheel. God lets these kinds of things happen without really taking a stand. None of that is acceptable to the rabbis either. Arlene.
Okay, but there's also something in the passage talking about the soul, and you get the feeling that what we're seeing when we see good people suffer, we're not seeing that there is a continuation beyond life on earth where God maybe will correct some of this. There's an implication that there is life beyond death in that passage, as far as I'm concerned.
Nice observation.
I didn't see that.
I think you're playing a lot with the word soul and the idea that
I am.
Yep, right. It's interesting. We could probably do a whole like seminar length class on the use of the word nefesh.
Okay.
Well, let's look at that. Okay, it's actually discussed in the next passage.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, for your sidebar comment in the chat window. Well taken, well taken. Okay, so looking at the next pericope here, Yachol, I might have thought, Yachol means it could be, afilu lo kiblu me'ahava. All right, so what if this person does not accept his suffering as a demonstration of God's love? You know, or he doesn't take it in a loving way. Like, what if it is just unmitigated misery and a person is angry or denies God or curses God and cannot get to a place of, I'm suffering because God loves me. So, Yachol afilu lo kibla me'ahava. So I might have thought that God delights in that person even if he does not accept his suffering with love. Talmud lomar, rather, it is taught, or this is why the verse comes to say, Im tasim asham nafsho, if his soul would offer itself in guilt. This is very challenging stuff. Just as a guilt offering is brought knowingly, as it is one of the sacrifices offered willingly without coercion. So a guilt offering, by the way, it's described in the Torah portions from the last couple of weeks, as we're reading from the book of Leviticus in our ongoing cycle of weekly Torah readings. Here it is, mid-April, book of Leviticus. Guilt and sin offerings and the like are discussed in the weekly Torah portions. Guilt offerings are free will offerings. They are not mandatory offerings. They are, if you feel that you have something for which you need to atone, you bring one of these free will guilt offerings and it makes expiation for you. So too, suffering must be accepted knowingly. Okay. Af Yisurin lada'at. Suffering must be accepted intentionally, one being aware. In other words, I think what's being said here is that you've got to get to a place where you can reconcile your suffering as a demonstration of God's love. Well, like I said, there's a lot in this I don't like, though I do like the window it gives us into the lengths to which the rabbis will go to make sense of the human condition. And this is the core stuff of religious thought, right? Why are these bad things happening to me? Aaron.
Did the rabbis ever think about or discuss or, document anywhere what they thought the long-term consequences of this type of theology might be for individuals?
Like the psychological, like how much therapy you would need?
Yeah, I mean, in order to not say God can't prevent these things, they put it all on the individuals and say, it's your responsibility to just accept this. And then, like, did they not think about what that does to people as they're going through these things?
I don't know. I do know that, again, the subject is so voluminous, which is why I found that it would be suitable for a long form inquiry this whole semester. And even then, we're only going to scratch the surface. And knowing that is probably helpful. Like, this is not a comprehensive, there would be, you could spend years studying this in rabbinic literature. A meaningful counterpoint is found in all of the many midrashim on this week's Torah portion. So for the last several weeks, we've been studying the various required sacrifices and offerings. And this week, we take a little bit of a detour into narrative, which is unusual for the book of Leviticus, right? The book of Leviticus is basically cultic regulation, how to be a holy community, how to live an ethical life, how to be a member of a ritual cult that uses sacrifices and offerings to propitiate the deity. But there is a little detour, and it's this week's portion in Leviticus, into narrative, into storytelling again. And the story that is told is of the ordination ceremony of Aaron and his family. So the Torah portion that we're reading this week is called Shmini, which means the eighth, meaning the eighth day. So Shmini, Bashmini means on the eighth day. And we learned in the book of Exodus that the dedication of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and the culminating ritual of the dedication of the tabernacle, or the tent, was the ordination of the priestly household, Aaron and his 4 sons, Nadav, Abihu, the 2 older, Eleazar and Itamar, the 2 younger. And as it turns out, on this 8th day ceremony, which was supposed to be a grand and joyful day for the whole Israelite community, something goes terribly awry. Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, approach the altar and, seemingly unbidden, offer what the Torah describes as Eish Zara. They offer alien fire, whatever that may mean. And in an instant, a giant explosion takes place, and God burns them to death in front of the entire community, and Aaron is stricken silent in his grief. And then there's a kind of rectification that's performed, but not really. Moses says, well, you failed to sanctify God, and it's pretty awful. As a result of this horrific incident described in the narrative of the book of Leviticus, the rabbis expend, figurative oceans of ink trying to figure out, well, what the hell did Nadav and Abihu do that was so bad? And what is the meaning of this, right? Aaron, what did Aaron do as a father to deserve 2 of his sons being vaporized right in front of his eyes on what should have been the happiest day of his professional life? And there are lots of conflicting proposals that the rabbis offer in the Midrash that is expounded on this section of the Torah. One of which, finally getting to an answer to Aaron's comment here, or Aaron's question, is when it comes to the suffering of the righteous, we have no answer. Another Midrash proposes that God wept along with Aaron and his family. So there are some Midrashim that wish to exonerate God from responsibility for the deaths of these 2 young boys, probably like visualize adolescence, right? They were old enough to be carrying fire pans up for an offering, but they were not fully grown men. So they are still very much boys in the eyes of their father. What could possibly explain or justify what Aaron goes through, let alone the fact that his 2 sons also die in this horrific way? And some of the rabbis, at least, I think, are theologically brave enough to say nothing can justify it. We don't know. As for the psychological trauma that trying to twist yourself into knots to accept whatever suffering one might experience as a verdict, an edict of love, as opposed to a punishment for wrongdoing, that I cannot say. But I think well, as Audrey said, Jewish guilt is a heavy burden to carry. Michelle, and then Mom and Dad, please.
So you started today's session by referencing the structure used, for example, in Deuteronomy of the blessings and the curses, which is at a very broad level. If the people of Israel do something wrong, then you get this, and if you do something wrong, we get that. And we certainly have seen that as a process, shall we say, across Jewish history when things go bad. We look at it at a macro whole people level. Now the things we're talking about here with individual illness or something like that are very much at a micro level. Nadav and Abihu did something wrong. They had to suffer. Their family had to suffer. And this is at the individual level. You can make any story you want with one story at a time, one story at a time, one person. The question becomes, when do you look at a higher level for patterns or broader lessons? Is one person not studying Torah enough going to condemn the whole people? Do you need 50%? Do you need 75%?
Right.
Do you do that? And are those in fact reconcilable?
Yeah, I think that your comments are very well taken. And of course, I'll do it before somebody else does it. I'll just mention the Holocaust because never in the history of the Jewish people, or at least not since the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews of Spain by the hundreds of thousands, or before that, the destruction of the temple, have Jews endured the kind of mass suffering that the Holocaust brought. And many Jewish communities, particularly those of a certain, what we would today call Haredi or ultra-Orthodox orientation, propose that the collective suffering of the Jewish people was on account of the sins of some of the Jewish people. Right, so that it's not, and who's to blame? Well, some will say Reform Jews are responsible for the Holocaust. We violated God's will by changing the Torah, and therefore God punished the whole Jewish people as a collective. Again, probably the most theologically obnoxious statement, but widespread in the way in which it caught on among certain Haredi Jews and continues to be held today. And it's part of the reason for such antipathy by Haredi Jews against Reform Jews, which is playing out in very spicy ways in Israel today. So, yeah, how many people going astray from the covenant does it take to cause God to respond with punishment? Who is to say? But ours would not be the first generation to conjecture around exactly that question. Okay, so let's move forward. Proceeding through this very difficult tangle of theology. So one must accept one's suffering knowingly. Ve'im kiblam ma secharo. So if one does accept one's suffering, if you simply say, okay, God, I know you love me, and that's why I'm suffering, what is my reward? What is that person's reward? Yir'eh zera ya'arich yamim. So that, I don't like this. Yireh zera ya'arich yamim doesn't necessarily mean that he might see his children lengthen his days. That's a bad translation. I think a better translation is so that his offspring might see their days lengthened. But the first translation is theologically illogical, right? Because if you've got, okay, let's take my congregant's parent, age 67, terminal lung cancer. The plain fact is, everyone can see, he will not live to see his children reach old age, or his grandchildren, presently ages 4.5 and 2.5, reach fullness of even childhood. That's the likely scenario. We will pray for a miracle. But the likely scenario is he won't live very long. However, the reward for suffering that's proposed here is that your offspring will live to see length of days. And again, I think all of this is still within the categorization of suffering as illness. We're within, Michelle asked the question, well, what do we mean by Yisurin? What kinds of suffering count as God's chastisements of love, using the phrase that is used here and throughout rabbinic literature? Yisurin shel Ahava, illness. Let's start with illness. And if you can endure the suffering and accept the suffering as a demonstration of God's love for you, the reward is that your offspring will live to see their days lengthened. Okay, well, there's no guarantee of that either, by the way. Maybe one can comfort oneself with the knowledge that those who come after us live on and therefore perpetuate our legacy. And maybe we can rationalize, and I'm using the word rationalize intentionally, justify, rationalize that as that alone substantiates or rationalizes my suffering. I'm suffering, but I know that those who live after me will carry forth my legacy, and that gives me some comfort. I didn't say you had to like it. I just said you had to enter into rabbinic discourse with me today. Okay, Mom and Dad, you've had your hand up.
I mean, surely you have seen examples in your professional career of people who don't accept Yisurin as chastisement from a loving God, but in fact say, I'm done. I'm not coming back to services ever again. Or even if it's not a public declaration, it might be in the soul. I can't believe in this anymore. I'll go through the charade, but this means nothing. I remember a family in our brief residence in New Bedford who suffered the tragedy of their son dying of brain cancer, and they were, pillars of the synagogue, but they, attempted to come back on high holidays and couldn't do it. Very publicly walked out. So I'm sure you've seen this, rather than comforting, to be totally shattering, and to be an alienation of people from faith and belief in God, rather than a further adherence.
Yeah, hence one of the most important things they teach you in rabbinical school, or at least they taught us in rabbinical school, which is you don't talk theology in a hospital room. Right? When families, you can talk theology in my office, but when a person is suffering or a person is dying and you're standing with them around, what might be a deathbed, that isn't a time to teach them this passage of Talmud. There's also, I think, a lack of theological humility in doing that. Of saying, I come here as the rabbi with answers for why you're suffering. All of that is way outside my pay grade. I mean, I have my own answers. Some people like them and some people don't. I think that people suffer for the simple reason that, as I've said many times before, and now you can probably quote me because I've used it in this class, because the universe is not calibrated to human notions of fairness. Like, read the book by I forget his first name, Mukherjee, The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. It's an outstanding book. But it just makes it clear that cancer is, serves a particular biological function. It may be, and not all cancer is the same, by the way, but some cancers may simply be the way in which the body shuts itself down, which is why, by the way, cancer has risen to be the #2 cause of death in the developed world, because we're just living longer. And so we're outliving the things that would have killed us 50 or 100 years ago. And we're dying of cancer because cancer is the way in which bodies shut down when they've lived long enough. And that it isn't a punishment from God. It's actually part of the natural functioning of human biology. That book comforted me. And maybe we will, quote unquote, cure cancer, or more likely develop therapies to extend life so that we can negotiate cancers with increasing efficacy. That is proposed by, among others, the futurist Yuval Noah Harari in his books Sapiens and Homo Deus. He basically believes that we're going to be able to defeat cancer and live indefinitely long lives. So that will be interesting. That will change our outlook on what it means to be a person and what suffering looks like. In any case, sure, I've met people who have walked away. More often, I've met people whose, walk through the valley of the shadow of death actually brings them closer to the beauty of the Jewish tradition and the comfort that being part of a Jewish community can bring. It's not I would say, I don't have numbers on it, but I've known more people who feel closer to synagogue, Judaism, tradition through suffering than people who have been so afflicted for no reason, no fault of their own, that they've had to walk away from it because it's too painful. But yeah.
It's comforting news to hear that.
Yeah. Aaron?
I guess I have a question. First of all, we have come significantly far in terms of cancer, and a lot are curable these days, which is incredible. And it also makes me wonder, though, none of these passages, they say you're supposed to accept your suffering, period.
Knowingly, yeah.
How does that square with being treated for all of these things? That's fighting the will of God.
Right. So I received a private chat in the chat window from one of us. Thank you, Diane. I'm outing you because it was a great comment. Here's what Diane wrote. I don't see it that way. I can't make the leap to one's acceptance of suffering redounding to the advantage of their children. But maybe, and I love how you didn't just stop there. Maybe acceptance allows one to live longer and to be with loved ones longer. And does acceptance mean doing nothing? Or does aggressive treatment imply lack of acceptance? It's hard to know because, of course, we're talking about literature that's 1,500 years old, possibly more, possibly slightly less. So not in the environment of modern medicine, but generally, even the most orthodox authorities have been very embracing of any and all possible advances in medical science that prolong life and possibly promote quality of life. So generally, aggressive intervention for illness is viewed as consonant with Jewish teaching. After all, God endowed the human with certain incredible faculties, and that the ability to build knowledge not just across a lifetime, but across generations, and to impart knowledge to the next generation so that knowledge can actually increase, is seen as kind of a divinely sanctioned, a divinely favored activity. And moreover, the Talmud has a beautiful, elegant statement about what a person should do when one is sick. I can't quote chapter and verse right now off the top of my head, but I can certainly find it. It says, when a person is sick, see a doctor, which I love. It's one of my favorite lines in all of Talmud, right? So there's this, and it appears to me that it might even be rooted in a theological polemic against those faiths that would say, if you're sick, start praying, right? Or even today, we have religions that eschew medical treatment, say, no, God will save you. It's like, schmuck, go see a doctor, right? Why would suffering in such a view is not something to be endured politely to the point where one abstains from medical intervention. That has never really been a mainstream Jewish view. That goes beyond asceticism into what I would say Judaism would consider to be foolishness. Michelle also comments in the chat window, there's also a teaching that one should remove interference from one who is dying. Right. We may actually have time to get to that, not today, but before our semester wraps up. It's one of my favorite Talmudic passages. It's really about what we would call euthanasia, though that's anachronistic in the context of Talmud. But it does talk about if somebody is suffering at the end of life, it is possible to remove barriers to death, to hasten death in order to alleviate suffering. So again, I would not extrapolate from one Talmudic passage a kind of grand unified theory of how the rabbis think about suffering altogether. This is a survey course, and each week we are building a kind of patchwork quilt of rabbinic ideas about suffering. And what one must develop the ability to do is kind of zoom the lens out and not get too hung up on any one comment, but to admire the quilt in which the individual squares are often really different from one another. And that is consistent with Talmud generally. right? You have to, if you're going to study Talmud, if you're going to embrace Talmud as a spiritual discipline, you really have to be comfortable with dissonance. And you have to be comfortable with the idea that sometimes out of individual pieces of dissonance, a harmony is produced, right? There's a bigger picture here. And what I take away is, here we have centuries of hundreds of rabbis in dialogue with each other, both the living and the dead, confronting the great questions of what it means to be a human being in a very difficult world. And out of that, it is natural to expect that you will have divergent voices on the meaning and possible responses to human suffering, where no one voice is necessarily deemed to be an authoritative opinion. So you have to kind of release yourself, liberate yourself from what you might assume a religious text is here to do, which is provide you with a kind of doctrinal overview of how we deal with suffering. So if you're saying, wow, I really didn't like what the rabbis said on April 13th when we looked at Berakhot chapter 5a, okay, like, good for you. Good for you not liking them. You're not alone. Norman.
I had an interesting clinical experience many, many years ago where a woman was referred to me who was a member of the Chabad Lubavitcher community.
For those who don't know, Norman was a practicing psychiatrist.
She was totally psychotic. I would give her the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenic and totally unapproachable. She needed medication, probably hospitalization. She would hear none of it. Finally, the decision was to call the Rabbi, which is exactly what I did. And the message of the Rabbi to her was, do what the doctor tells you. And that was the catalyst that made all the difference.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's great, Norm. Great. Thank you. I'm so glad that your lived experience corroborated something from the tradition. That's really nice. Yeah. Okay. So as we proceed, we have time for, I think, another sugya. We'll finish this sugya. So, all right. So you're suffering, but your children will have long life. Oh, all right. That's comforting, though it may not actually be true. Moreover, gloss, in addition to these earthly rewards, meaning the ability of children to have long life, his study will endure. And of course, Steinsaltz puts in the word Torah study, but that is assumed. We're not talking about being good at math. His study will endure, and his Torah study will be successful. I don't think that gloss adds much. As it is stated, as it is written, the purpose of Adonai, here understood to be Torah, meaning the revelation of God's will, might prosper by his hand. And that quote, unfortunately, is not given a citation. So I'd have to go and look it up. I tried to click on it, and unfortunately, it doesn't tell me where the Chefetz Adonai biyado yitzlach, the purpose of Adonai or the desire of Adonai will prosper by his hand. So in other words, if you accept your suffering, if you're able to reconcile yourself to your suffering, not as punishment from God, but as a demonstration of God's love, all is not lost. All is not lost. Your Torah may endure. All right, let's move on just a little bit. I'd like to get to one more passage today, and then, as we usually do, take just a little time for comments or questions at the end. Okay. All right, so here's where things get interesting, right? And again, don't look at the plain print. Only the boldface is what's written in the actual Talmud. Pligi ba. Pligi, palag, the root in Aramaic means to disagree or to separate. So pligi ba, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, the Rabbi Acha bar Chanina. So Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi and Rabbi Acha bar Chanina disagree. And this probably means with each other, but also with what has just been stated. So we have the Talmud as it is. The way of the Talmud will provide a corresponding disagreement for a statement that's just been made. Chadamar, one of them says, probably the first, so Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Chadamar, one of them says, Eluhem Yisurim shel Ahava. These are in fact afflictions of love. Kol she'en bahen bitul Torah. Shenem, anything that doesn't cancel out one's study of Torah. So in other words, anything which does not afflict one's body, as it says in the gloss, to the extent that you are unable to study Torah. So long as you've got Torah, you can have terminal lung cancer, you can be laid up in bed, but if you, and let's just say not advanced Alzheimer's disease, right? As long as you are not being afflicted in a way that prevents you from learning Torah, it must be an affliction of God's love, because God, above all, the greatest way in which God demonstrates love is through Torah. How do we know that? Well, it's all over our tradition. We say it every morning in our prayers and every evening in our prayers. We preface the words of Shema, which is the first big recitation of Torah in a service, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, into Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, which is Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting at verse 4. So the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, as we call it, are a Torah reading mapped into the morning and the evening services. The last word before we recite Shema is always the word Ahava, or something having to do with love. In the morning service, we say Baruch Ata Adonai Habocher Ba'amo Yisrael Be'ahava, who has chosen the Jewish people in love. Shema Yisrael. Now we're going to show, but we're now going to show that love by proclaiming Torah. In the evening, we say Baruch Ata Adonai Ohev Amo Yisrael. Blessed is the one who loves the Jewish people. Shema Yisrael. How do we know that God loves us? God gave us the Torah. So anything that does not preclude or fully inhibit our ability to engage with Torah, even if we are suffering, must be coming from a place of God's love for us. You don't have to like it. I just want you to understand rabbinic logic, because this is not easy. This is not Pirkei Avot, my friends. Like Pirkei Avot, I think you've come to appreciate, if you've been studying with me for the long haul, that we're in a whole new difficulty level. This is like, single or double black diamond slopes here. So just looking at the remainder of this passage. So one says anything that does not inhibit one from studying Torah must come from a place of love. As it is stated, here's the proof text: happy is the one you afflict, O God, and teach from your Torah. So in other words, they're making a causal link between phrase A and phrase B in this statement, which again, they don't provide a citation. Shame on Safaria. I'll try and make sure I can look it up for next time. Ashrei hagever, blessed is the man, asher tiyasrenu, from the same word Yisurin, chastisements, whom you chastise, or Adonai chastises, Yah being one of the names of God, umi toratcha tilamdenu. Oh wait, that was the phrase from before. That was Psalms 90, there it is. Happy the one you punish, O God, and teach out of your law. Psalms 94:12. I remembered it. So that's why they didn't provide a citation. Now, the other argument, so presumably if the first one was Rabbi Yaakov Bar Idi, this fellow over here, lived in Tyre, which is in modern-day Lebanon, and was considered such a great expert in Jewish law that questions were sent to him even though he lived out of the way. He was a student of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and also Rabbi Yochanan, two of the great Mishnaic sages. So he's an early Amora, right, of the community Amoraim, the later stratum of, or the later community of rabbinic scholars of the second and third generations, middle of the 3rd century of the Common Era to the early part of the 4th century. And his counterpart here, Rabbi Acha Bar Chanina, we don't have a bio on this fellow, unfortunately. Okay, the other one, Acha Bar Chanina, says, afflictions of love are any that do not cause dereliction in the recitation of prayer. So it's not about study of Torah, but rather the phrase that is used to back it up is, blessed is God who did not turn away my prayer, from Psalm 66. Despite one's suffering, as Steinsaltz glosses here, the afflicted is still capable of praying, which, by the way, could be different from the ability to study Torah. A person afflicted with advanced Alzheimer's disease may still, and I've seen this, by the way, I worked extensively in nursing homes in my rabbinical school career. Patients with Alzheimer's were often not able to participate in Torah study at the nursing home, but were often able to attend minyan and daven with us. because it was from their childhood, right? They could totally daven the avot, like they knew all the prayers by heart. They didn't have to look at a prayer book, though they could. They could actually read the prayer book and daven along with us, but they couldn't have a conversation. So different kinds of capacities in a person might be afflicted, the ability to pray not being the same as the ability to learn Torah. You may say, well, this is fairly picayune, but I think what's being suggested here is that so long as we are able to do the Jewish thing, God must still love us, right? We must still in some way be recipients of God's favor, because we're able to do the things that define us as Jews. We're able to learn Torah, or we're able to pray. Okay, that's where we're going to pause for today. I promise there's more. And where this goes is, this goes to some astonishing places, including maybe my all-time favorite Talmudic passage, though I'm already feeling culpable for having told you that about some other passages. So but we're going to look next week we're going to just continue directly from here with suffering and how we deal with it. And we're especially going to look at a couple of anecdotes that are related about some rabbis who endured suffering and how they dealt with it. And what do we do with all of this? So I hope that if today brought you to a place of theological or emotional discomfort, I'm going to invite you to just stick with this a while longer. Next week, we meet on April 20th. The following week on the 27th, I actually do want to take a moment to clarify my calendar so that I'm aware. We don't meet on the 20th. We do meet on the 20th. We don't meet the 27th. And we don't meet the 4th because I'm involved in the ceremony of honorary doctorates at HUC. So we're not meeting the 27th or the 4th. We resume on the 11th, and we meet consecutively the 11th, the 18th, and I think we're going to meet on the 25th, even though it's Erev Shavuot. I'd like to have that time set aside, even if it's not what's on the calendar. I'll make sure that it gets changed. That should give us enough to get through some more significant passages on suffering that I'd really like for us to look at. So as I was saying, if you were brought to a place of emotional or theological discomfort today, please just lean in, don't lean away, stick with this, come back for the subsequent sessions, because there will be some passages that I'm confident you might find meaningful and comforting even. Some really beautiful passages. Comments, questions to close out today's study, please? In that case, I'm grateful for your presence and your participation and the gift of your own human insights, which adds so richly to our dialogue from the Talmud. So thank you so much.
Well, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Tודה רבה.
Early Shabbat Shalom. Take care.
Early Shabbat Shalom.
Bye.